Thank you, Sharon. Good morning, everyone, and thank you so much for coming. So I'm just going to give an overview of Oxford University Press, go into a history of sort of our dictionary publishing and licensing activities, then talk about some of the case studies of ways in which the Global Language Solutions has gone out to aggregate the world's leading dictionary data to license it and service it to some of the most important sort of platforms, products, services, and innovations that we all use every day, and then talk about some of the places that we're going that are really exciting, and hopefully places that will address some of the challenges and really interesting questions that have been raised by Anthony and Samara. We're a department of the University of Oxford. We're actually a nonprofit. Everything we publish fulfills our education mission. We're larger than all the English language university presses in the rest of the world combined. That would be 110 university presses in the US plus Cambridge, and we account for 55% of the university press market. According to a global ranking of publishing industry, we're the 25th largest publisher. And as I say, everything we publish is in service of our mission, which is to further the university's objective of excellence in research, scholarship, and education through our worldwide publishing activities. We're a global organization with over 6,000 employees. We've got publishing branches which publish locally into local markets in 13 countries and more than 50 other offices worldwide. This is an overview of some of our digital dictionary initiatives and projects. The OED, of course, is the historical record of the English language, and OED.com is a subscription-based platform that is available to both individuals as well as universities, libraries, and institutions. ODO is our free general-purpose consumer website. OGLS is the initiative that started 5 years ago as a B2B foreign language dictionary data sourcing, customization, and licensing program. Our newest initiative is the Oxford Dictionaries API, which is a really exciting way in which we've opened up our valuable, authoritative, human-curated dictionary data to small and medium-sized developers for free on the web. And there are pricing plans that start with free, and this is just to encourage uptake and development with our rich dictionary resources. This is both English, but also many of the foreign languages that we're moving into, and I'll tell you more about in the course of this presentation. Babla is a German-based multilingual dictionary database that specializes in foreign language word pairings, and that was an acquisition of Oxford's a couple years ago, primarily to utilize their expertise in SEO, but also their innovative and new methods for language data creation, which we're using and have learned from as part of our OGL initiative. The Oxford Global Language Initiative is a 10-year funded project by the university, which we're very proud of, and the mission is to digitize 100 digitally underrepresented languages, or as have been referenced today as low-density languages or low-resource languages, where no current quality dictionary data currently exists. By building and launching microsites into these markets, submitted entries are moderated by language champions in forums, and those language champions are linguists in those particular languages. These are not languages in danger of going extinct. However, they're languages that are spoken by upwards of 10 million people as kind of a baseline. They have some sort of official status in those countries, but lack well-structured tagged lexical data, which makes building language tools and applications such as spell checkers, predictive text engines, education technology platforms, or NLP tools, as we saw today in Samara's presentation, quite challenging and difficult, or even quite impossible. And because the lack of rich data stifles innovation and educational progress in those markets, that's why we've taken up this cause. This is actually a toaster that toasts or prints text onto toast. And when I knew that Anthony was going to be presenting and I was going to be going after him, I thought I just needed something a little bit funny or just to sort of lighten up the energy in here.
I know I can hear you when you speak.
Our Oxford Dictionaries licensing program is at the forefront of technology, and that's primarily my role, is to make available the rich digital resources that we have to the marketplace. But I'm not just going to be giving you a product pitch here today. That's not the goal of this morning. But I will give you some context, which is important, I think, for our licensing business. The OED was digitized in the 80s, and in 1985, Steve Jobs traveled to Oxford in search of digital rights to the OED. He left without the OED, but he did leave with a licensing deal to offer the Oxford Complete Works of Shakespeare and the Oxford Dictionary of Quotations onto his new Next computer system, which was targeted specifically at the education market. The deal paid OUP $1 royalty per copy. We've continued that fantastic partnership with Apple. I'm sorry to say we don't get $1 royalty on every Oxford work that is published on every iOS or iPhone or Mac computer, of course. Steve did ultimately find his computer partner for Next, which at the time was Merriam-Webster, but I'm proud to say that we are now supplying and sourcing all of the foreign dictionary data on those products and services. In the 1990s and into the 2000s, Oxford Dictionary publishing focus shifted significantly into the global languages market for both English language teaching and ESL in Asia. And believe it or not, millions of these branded, dedicated handheld pocket dictionaries are still common with students in Japan, China, Taiwan, and South Korea, despite the popularity, obviously, of smartphones and apps now. And in 2007, we proudly became the partner with Kindle for the embedded English dictionary lookup on the Amazon Kindle device, and we've been crucial to their local internationalization efforts with many bilingual dictionaries and even a Hindi monolingual dictionary. Here's an example of the ways in which our core English data has powered some really very familiar interfaces that we all use on a daily basis. This is the Semantic English Language Database, which is the core IP that powers our consumer dictionary website. And here you can see it powering dictionary lookup if you define : any sort of entry. And here's a breakdown of how that Semantic English Language Database is composed. It's actually a suite of 4 major databases, the 2 major English thesauri, along with the 2 major English monolingual dictionaries, the Oxford Dictionary of English, which is World English and UK English, as well as the NOAD, which is the North American New Oxford American Dictionary. And it's semantically tagged around a corpus of 2 million human curated example sentences, and it's linked at a sense level, so that actually makes it quite a valuable annotated resource and corpora. And it's linked across the 2 major thesaurus databases, the Oxford American Writers Thesaurus and the Oxford Thesaurus of English, which gives you that linked synonyms feature if you look at the display on the search engine. And here you can see that same data surfaced in the Google Translate user interface, and that monolingual data down on the bottom giving definitions along with the synonyms. We'd like to think that some of this informs the Google Translate product, but we can't say for certain. So Oxford Global Language Solutions was started about 5 years ago in response to some of our biggest technology partners' needs as they moved into the international marketplace. Obviously, since the 80s, when we digitized the OED, we knew how to structure dictionary data, well-tagged data, how to convert it to structured data in XML, and we knew what good quality content was, and as a global organization, we had the connections and partnerships with publishers in some respect. But as we went out into the marketplace to source leading monolingual data, we learned a lot, and we saw new opportunities where the tradition just wasn't as strong in foreign languages for monolingual dictionary data as it was in English. Much of the data we found was not structured at all. In many cases, it was just print. There'd been no creation of sort of structured XML at all. And so what the Oxford Global Language Solutions did was position ourselves as a one-stop shop for all of your dictionary sourcing, conversion, and customization needs. This is a case study of the leading Russian monolingual dictionary, the Ozhigov, which is published in partnership with the Linguistic Institute of Moscow. When I came across this publisher, it was a very small office. They had one kind of dusty edition and no previous digital format. And we had several customers that were looking for monolingual Russian data. And so we did data capture to convert it and tagged it and structured it to our uniform structure that most of our monolingual dictionary data is organized in, and which our licensees had grown accustomed to developing with. And here you can see it now featured in the Russian lookup in Google Russia. And this is a similar display case for the Bing search engine, and this is a display of our Spanish monolingual partners' content powered by Oxford Dictionaries. And I'm proud to say that there was a blog post and a release this spring of Hindi monolingual dictionary data on Google in India, and this was the statement that they made, that there are currently 400 million internet users in India, but only 20% of the population fluent in English. Most internet users have significant language barriers to getting the full value of the internet. A speaker of Indian languages like Hindi or Tamil still has trouble finding content to read or use services that they can use in their own languages. To build rich and empowering experiences for everyone means first and foremost making things work in the languages people speak. Today we're taking a huge step forward by launching a new set of products, and actually our Hindi monolingual dictionary data has powered other sort of natural language processing tools that they've made available to the Indian developer marketplace. And here's a display of that Hindi monolingual dictionary on a mobile interface on Google India. But this didn't, our focus on digital, of course, was driven because we saw indications, obviously, that the print dictionary market was in decline, but this didn't ultimately kill our print publishing activities, not by any means. In the last 5 years, we've published authoritative, leading, and the most current and biggest Arabic and Portuguese bilingual dictionaries that have ever before been published, due to market intelligence that told us that there really was nothing out there for those markets, and we're quite proud of those. And this data, in fact, was licensed to Duolingo, which, if you're familiar, is a really innovative app for language learning, started by Louis Von Ahn at Carnegie Mellon. And in fact, one of the business models behind that was he was going to leverage that language teaching to translate the web. Louis was one of the founders and creators of reCAPTCHA, which crowdsources human intelligence to sort of tag images, and is what is also used as a security measure for proving that you're not a bot. But our bilingual data powering Duolingo dictionaries, and the fact that he was using that human intelligence behind that app to translate websites such as the BBC or CNN is really quite impressive. And as we went out and established these partnerships and digitized what is now over 40 leading monolingual dictionary databases in some of the world's most popularly spoken languages, we found a need and an opportunity to leverage the data within that, now that it had been semantically tagged, the metadata existed, to output additional products and services, or such as word lists and lexicons. And some of these lexicons have been used to localize popular social word games such as Words with Friends into 4 major European languages, as well as Brazilian Portuguese. and the very difficult and challenging task of gamifying these word lists and making them family-friendly or user-friendly and scrubbing out offensive terms, vulgarities. And some of the really confounding characteristics of this aspect are that there are certain senses of words, not primary senses necessarily, that may be offensive or derogatory. When we first delivered a word list that didn't have the words yellow or red, which are obviously common words, we found that they'd been scrubbed for offensive meanings unintentionally. And this continues to confound us with some other words, which I won't repeat here, which have quite offensive common usage, but actually are less common legitimate words. And so it's very, very difficult and an ongoing challenge of where you draw those lines. And it changes all the time, certainly. This is one of the most interesting partners that we worked with and that I'm quite proud of, is WUD3Words. And what this developer did was how many people are familiar with this? Great. So what he did was he divided the world into 3 meter by 3 meter squares. There's approximately 57 trillion squares, and assigned each one of these unique word addresses a 3-word address. And right here, I have the 3-word address for where we stand right now, which is Quiz Copies Fishery. And this was in response to, he was an event producer, he was producing music events, and he was in the middle of a field in northern England, and the lighting crew hadn't shown up because they had a GPS coordinate in the middle of a field that was 18 digits long. And he said, oh, here's a real opportunity. It's localized across 9 languages. And what we had to do was ultimately, remove homophones, also remove offensive words across these 9 languages. But also, it's got real use cases. I mean, he's partnered with major postal services around the world. Poor addressing means deliveries go astray. Addressing around the world isn't suitable for everyday needs. Street addresses can be inaccurate or ambiguous. Road names are repetitive. Homes and businesses are often located far from the center of the postcode. 75% of the world suffers from poor addressing or none at all. The other 25 still lacks universal coverage. The geospatial industry is worth up to $150 billion annually. Precise and consistent location referencing would not only improve global addressing, it could also connect you to untapped customer bases. And he's even partnered with the UN to address disaster relief efforts in places where there is no addressing system. And you can just see the potential when it comes to drone deliveries and Amazon when you want something delivered to you on the spot. Here's some of the partners that we work with. Just going back to that other slide. The UN estimates that 4 billion people lack a reliable way to address their homes. As such, they are denied access to basic social and civic services. They struggle to open bank accounts, register a birth, or access electricity or water supplies. Without the ability to communicate where they live, these people become invisible to the state. Now, this doesn't address the challenges with urban addressing. If you've got a 60-story building at a 3-word address, it becomes slightly more challenging, but obviously this technology wasn't designed to address those challenges. Here's some of the partners that we currently work with, and I was just having a conversation outside about this project we just did with AXA, which is relevant in many ways to some of the work we've been doing. They had an international content management system across 10 international offices. And how do you tag content for a content management system for marketing, let's say, across all of those language markets so that your marketing managers can consistently store and retrieve marketing assets across those languages? It's not quite as simple as one would think when it comes to direct parallel translation across 10 languages. So, Global Languages Initiative, which I talked about, it's to build usable lexical content for 100 of the world's languages, and these are not languages in danger of extinction, but digitally underrepresented. And this is a look at some of the microsites that we've launched. This is the one for isiZulu. 46% of the world's population has access to the internet. The internet remains dominated by a very few number of global languages. In 2015, just 10 languages accounted for 82% of the content on the internet. This is a practical issue, but also an emotional and political one that goes to the heart of the language identity, sense of belonging, and linguistic pride. So we've got 4 broad goals and aims and initiatives of this project. Launching websites or other consumer-facing access points, so these microsites. Developing communities and engagement through these microsites. Bringing languages into the program that are currently underrepresented on the internet. And developing capability to do all this on the one hand around content, data models, and technology, and the other around sustainable revenue streams to fund the program long term. So when we presented at a UN Millennium Goals conference at the UN, a lot of people suggested, well, what is in it for Oxford? You know, I mean, we've done quite well in marketing and promoting the English language around the world. Obviously, English is the dominant language, and as Anthony raised earlier, a lot of people have said, why are you doing, you know, they ask the question, why are you doing something? You know, what's the point? And ultimately, it's mission-based, but also we see a real need for this language data, as has been articulated by our previous presenters. Here are 10 languages that launched in phase 1, and I'm happy to say that these have all launched on microsites right now with active language communities, one of which is Indonesian, has been very successful on the ground, particularly because we have a very good language champion in Indonesia who hosts live events, kind of these word-a-thons where people come together that are passionate about the language and they contribute to the living dictionary. Phase 2 will launch a further 25 languages, and it's a moving target. We change which languages we're moving based on where we have the most success. Right now we're focusing tremendously on the Indian market, but there's real challenges about source content, and so we sort of are quite agile in that approach. Here's some growth statistics on first year and engagement with these microsites and engagement with user-generated, success with user-generated content. You see that very high spike. That's the Indonesian partner. And I think that that event in November was due to one of these word-a-thons that was hosted. And phase 2 will include 20 language websites with a focus on Indian languages. And Casper and I recently went to India, and it's quite amazing all of the challenges presented by Indian languages. When it comes to code mixing, when it comes to scripts, Hindi language challenges, predominance of code mixing across a multilingual society, importance of transliteration when it comes to the number of official languages, multiple scripts with almost 50 primary characters in Devanagari alone, and a lack of uniform standards for web publishing, so Unicode issues, and the challenges that creates for aggregating data and for research. We found that we developed a chatbot here to promote user-generated content. It was developed on the back end leveraging our API, and it's a simple vocabulary quiz using the Hindi dictionary endpoint, and it's a framework that can be scaled out to the other languages. But one of the things that we noted was the uptake of sort of engagement with the website wasn't what we'd hoped it was, because we were leveraging a soft keyboard, when in fact we found the importance and high value of transliteration techniques across all the Indian languages. People are reluctant to open up a soft keyboard when they'd much rather sort of enter in transliterated entries. And of course, some of the technology partners that we work with that have been working in these markets for much longer than we had been, we're certainly familiar with this, and we're interested in and continue to be interested in transliteration data across the numerous official languages in India. So here I'm going to talk a little bit about our data approach now. The way in which people are using and companies are using data is changing. Data is becoming created and consumed at ever-increasing rates. And importantly, it is being linked. And we see the opportunities in the semantic web for this linked data. So we launched our API program to encourage this. That's for me, not for Catherine.
That's for you.
Yeah,
So
great. Great, thank you, thank you.
That was the secret.
I was telling you to speed up.
Yeah, thank you, thank you, thank you.
That was the secret signal.
Thank you very much. Let me see how I'm doing.
Okay, clearly not so far.
So I'm just going to touch on some of these exciting ways in which developers are using our API for social listening and sentiment analysis right now. This is a what is the meaning of dictionary bot that was launched on Facebook by one of our developers and came out of a API competition that we had. Contextual word sense disambiguation, spatial mapping. And one of our partners is here and has created an EdTech platform, which is an educational STEM vocabulary game engine for K through 12 with sequencing, crossword puzzles, word searches that is adaptive to curriculum. He uses the API for definition clustering by syntactic meaning in order to create learning maps. And this is something that's very exciting. Google has actually released an annotated corpora, which they used our new Oxford American Dictionary for, and they've made it available to the research space for them to leverage the valuable human-curated tagging within the Oxford American Dictionary across some readily open source available corpora. And what we're finding is a lot of developers are leveraging the powerful AI APIs that have been released by Google as part of the Google Brain project, such as TensorFlow, to pair AI technologies with NLP APIs and technologies to do some really interesting things. So this is a developer that is creating a whiteboard that will literally create glyphs as you dictate metaphors or business terms. It will illustrate automatically onto a whiteboard. And he's really interested in business lexicons because you have expressions like moonshot or growth hack or revenue hack, which are these sort of very abstract concepts and which he can now illustrate by pairing those with glyphs and illustrations. And then this is kind of a fun thing that I came across recently, that Facebook's AI was creating a language of its own, and somebody said that it was quite gibberish, but upon analysis I thought that it really was much more human than we'd care to admit sometimes in terms of intent and urgency. And they did this through human training techniques. And in fact, it got so good that they found that in negotiations, sort of machine learning and training aspects, that in many cases the machine was feigning interest in one thing in order to sacrifice it later in the negotiation, which is quite ingenious. And this is something that I come across with all the time, which we're addressing by surfacing frequency data, which is a new product. I've never told anybody to duck off in my life, but, and this is by design intentionally at Apple, but we have a new product which is a stats engine which will be surfacing frequency information from our large English corpora, which is really exciting because it can be used to address these types of incidents. And so I'm going to pass it off to my colleague Catherine Martin, head of US Dictionaries. And I think you're going to find what she has to say really exciting.
So I'm a practicing lexicographer, which means I write dictionaries. It's a different way to look at language data. We're all looking at the same types of data, but what I do with it is very different. It's very much at the micro level. But over time, I've come to appreciate that some of the tools that we use have other applications as well, or that there are implications from the interpretation that we do as part of dictionary making that can potentially have other applications as well. This is an example. So we use corpora, obviously, as the basis of much of our work. This simple graph here shows frequency by month based in our monitor corpus, which draws data from the web. And you can see that we started talking about the word populism a lot in June 2016 first. That's when the Brexit vote took place. And then it really began to surge in November 2016. And this is the kind of thing that we monitor. When you see a surge in the use of a word like that, it makes you revisit the entry. And so we looked at populism again and we said, what does this still mean what it used to mean? Do we need to address this? Are there implications that we're not considering for our human readers? And we as lexicographers think about the human reader above all. What do they want to know about the word? So our dictionaries are based on corpora, and that's for the current dictionaries, that's the main source of evidence. But what we do is a combination of human intuition and then checking against the data. And both of those things are really important. So we can check our assumptions, and then sometimes we're surprised by what the data tells us that we might not have expected. And our corpora are weighted and balanced to reflect a mix of global regions and different usage types. That's important because if I'm defining hangry, well, I know what that means. That's not very difficult. We can look at the context. It's very familiar. But if I use corpora to find a word that's very common in Indian English, I don't have a native speaker intuition about what that means. It's important for me to have lots of context. And our core competency as lexicographers is to do this type of analysis about a specific word and how it's used, and to think about how we can present that in a very clear way to our human readers. And we believe that that combination brings something special to the table that isn't there in the data alone and isn't there in the human intuition alone, that there's something about that work that we do that makes a good dictionary and that also can be leveraged for other purposes. So the two main English corpora that we have are the Oxford English corpus, which is our synchronic corpus. It's about 2.5 billion words. And it's good for core vocabulary, and it has a lot of detailed world English and domain classification. And then we have our monitor corpus, which grows by about 150 million tokens each month. It has, well, when I made this slide, it was 8 billion words, but it's more than that now. And it's what we use primarily to identify neologisms and see trends and changes over time. So it's a diachronic corpus. What I'm very excited about right now is the new monitor corpus that we're working on, which is going to build on that monitor corpus that we started with, but build in balanced coverage of more regional varieties of English. So Indian, Nigerian, Malaysian, these other English-speaking areas outside the core Anglosphere where their words are used in different ways, different words are used, and so we're able to draw that out. And we're also building in more genre categories, including social media and academic publications. From the earlier speakers today, you know that genre is really important. It influences so much about meaning and usage. We also have more domain classifications, and we're experimenting with different ways to apply domain, which is very difficult. Our Oxford English corpus looked at the text level to determine domain, and so then you would have a domain like news. We're hoping that in our new corpus project, we'll be able to go to a closer level, so that instead of saying that everything from the New York Times is news, we can say, well, if it's in the sports section, it's sports. Or even further than that. So, perhaps to use clustering to say, in this paragraph, we're talking about sports, and so that sentence belongs to the sports domain. And then we're looking at new approaches to evidence gathering as well, and using an element of popularity on the web when we're looking at web content. So not just looking statically at the same kinds of sources all the time, but privileging those that are pieces of web content that more people are seeing, because those are more influential, and that is in some way an important thing too. So lots of exciting stuff that we're developing now, and as a lexicographer, I can't wait for us to get those things available. So how do lexicographers use a corpus? This is a really basic concordance view from our Oxford English corpus. And you can just see from scrolling down this list that, okay, we know what footprint means, but when you see it here, it becomes obvious that the literal meaning of footprint is not the most common meaning of footprint in our sample of English. And so that metaphorical one is also a really important one for us to cover. I'm sure if you care about dictionaries at all or have ever given them any thought, you've heard about this idea about prescriptive versus descriptive. And the idea that all modern dictionaries are descriptive, which is to say that they look at the evidence for how the English language is used, and then they tell you what that is and summarize it for you. So when we look at a word like ambiance, it can be spelled in two ways. And we use our corpus frequency to tell you which one is the first one, the primary headword form. So the version with the E is the primary headword form, but we give you the version with the A as a secondary one because it's also very common, relatively speaking. But descriptivism is not absolute. So sometimes the numbers tell you something and it would still be regarded as wrong. A great example of this is the phrase just desserts. So if we look at I don't have a slide of it, but if I were to show you in our corpus how this is spelled, the majority of evidence for just desserts is spelled with two S's, like what you eat after dinner. But in fact, that word etymologically comes from a noun related to the word deserve, i.e. you get what you deserve, you're just desserts. And so even though most people writing in English in an unedited form do not know that, it's an important part of our description of the language to tell you, to give you as the headword form the single S form, and then to explain to you why, the history of the word. And so that's where, where our domain knowledge comes in. We know the history of the word, we know where it came from, and that historically it was spelled with one S. We know that there are people who talk about English usage and that they regard this as an incorrect use with the two S's, and so that's an important part of it doesn't mean that we're not describing it. Part of our description is to say, if you use this, these guys will say that you're making a mistake. And so these aspects are also important. Another thing we can do if we know genre is we can analyze it on the level of, well, how often do they spell it with an S in an edited text like a newspaper versus on social media. So that's another way that we can check, and we will see these things change over time sometimes, so that something that initially is a variant that only occurs in social media, unmediated, unedited context, then creeps into print. Something that I've been watching really closely is the pair home in on versus hone in on with an N. So home was the original word. It's a metaphor about like a homing beacon, radar. And over time, people have come to introduce this form with an N. I actually think that's a nicer metaphor. So it's not entirely that it's incorrect, but some people would regard the N form as incorrect. And we've been watching how this changes over time. And the one thing that we noticed is that it's progressing differently in American English and British English. So in American English, we're already more than half of the time people are saying hone in on. In fact, I wrote something for a publication, and I wrote home in on, and then they changed it with the editors. And I had to say back, I was like, well, you actually, I understand why you changed that, but we're the dictionary, and I really need you to use the M form instead. But there's, so that's an interesting fact, and it's progressing differently in different regions, and we can also see how it varies across different genres. So watch that space. So lots of other things that we take into account when we're looking at the corpus evidence. This is a word, jabroni, means a foolish or contemptible person. And it's a neologism, although not as new as we originally thought. It turns out it goes all the way back to the 1930s, and it's like this Italian dialect word, but it's most recently become popularized through wrestling, professional wrestling. So we needed to look at the different, how do you pluralize this? So we looked at different plurals, and then we look at the regional variation in usage to see whether this warrants a regional label, and we concluded that it did. Sometimes you have synonyms and that vary in their regionality. So in this case, we were able to see that the use of carer was markedly British, whereas that was not the case for caregiver. And the tool that we use for most of the time when we're analyzing our in-house corpora is this wonderful software called Sketch Engine, which is a set of proprietary corpus tools that are really well suited for lexicography specifically. And that allows us to look at a word's behavior in detail and we use this all the time to investigate every aspect of how we talk about a word. So here, one important thing that we can use it for is to think about the sense inventory. So that is the number of senses that you give for a particular word. Burn, we all know what the core sense of burn is, but when we look at the transitive use of burn as a verb and we see what the direct objects are, it's some other meanings of burn really come to the surface as being important and common in English. So burning calories, burning fat, and then burning CDs are uses of burn that would not have appeared in a dictionary in 1915, but that you would expect to see now. Everyone's always interested in where we get new words from, and the answer is, well, lots of places, mainly you. But specifically, what's challenging about new words is not finding them, because they are infinite. It's figuring out which ones to do first. So we sort of take the different possible new words that we could add to the dictionary in from many sources, and then we try to prioritize them based on sort of evidential criteria. But the sources that we get them from are editorial suggestions. So we have about 100 or editorial staff, I think, more or less, working across all of the dictionaries programs, and so we all share a database where we write we submit new words and the evidence we have on them. We get suggestions from the public, and then we also use automated tools. So one obvious gift is people searching for things on your website and not finding it. That's the best indication that there's a word that exists and that people want to know about it. Often what they want to know about is a misspelling of a word that you already have, but in a not insignificant number of cases, they're notifying you that there is this new and exciting word that you should be looking into. We can also do corpus analysis to see which strings or n-grams we have entries for and don't have entries for, and we can do that by comparing. We can look at particular domains or regions to see if there are phrases and words that are more common in one area, or one domain or region than another, if we're particularly interested in the Canadian variety of English, say. And then we can have gaps in analysis. This is another gift. Well, if you publish a lot of dictionaries, you can run their headword lists against each other, and anything that you don't have in your dictionary is automatically a suggestion. So we have lots of places of possible sources of words, and then ultimately it comes down to human decisions in deciding which ones are worthy of adding. Decisions are evidence-based, so we try to include words that are going to be encountered in genuine use in the wild by our readers, and we consider them a priority when we see significant evidence for them in a wide range of sources. And you can see at the bottom, so this is selfie stick. Neologisms come out in different ways, and you see all these different frequency patterns for the uptake, but in selfie stick, you have nothing, because the thing didn't exist. It exists, everyone's talking about it, and then it exists and we're talking about it at a normal amount because it's settled into use over time. Sometimes you get to that first peak and then it goes down again and no one cares anymore. And so what we try to avoid is putting a lot of effort into making an entry for something that's going to follow that trend line. Yes, cafefe. Yeah, cafefe, that's a great example. So yeah, surged in use in the immediate after. Yeah, I had it on my computer. I was looking at it. Yeah. And people looked at it like that was the most looked up thing on both the OED and ODO that month. Everyone was looking for cafefe, but yeah, unless it gets adopted and lexicalized, that's not going to be added to the dictionary. Okay, so I talked about English because that's what I know the most about, but we also have used corpora for the same purposes in other languages. So we had a Portuguese corpus with Brazilian and European Portuguese, and by using these methods, we were able to identify new words that hadn't previously been covered in any Portuguese dictionaries. The equivalents of cloud computing, social network, touchscreen, and tweetar, to tweet. The Arabic corpus was a project which Zach mentioned previously, was also really interesting. There are lots of challenges about analyzing a corpus of Arabic as opposed to the one of Portuguese or Spanish, but we were able to identify new words there as well by doing concordances and word lists from our corpus. This is a word sketch of an Arabic word, and we were also able to use the collocational information in the word sketch to identify a new sense that hadn't previously been covered in any Arabic dictionary. So this was really exciting. We had this word that we knew was widely recorded to mean system, but then we found these collocational patterns that clearly didn't mean that, and we were able to determine that it could also mean pace. So that's an example of how we are leveraging the collocational information to directly change what's in the dictionary. This is just showing you what our data looks like on the editorial end. We can extrapolate from this and kind of mix up all of the metadata. That's because it's recorded in this structured way. And sort of the exciting thing that Zach's working on is taking all the stuff that I and my colleagues do every day and finding ways to package it and make it useful for other purposes. So one of the things that's a key part of dictionaries is linking, and we have both, the cross-references that you see as a human, which, like when you link from one sense to another, so see this entry, but we also have other links that are human curated that are inside that metadata. So we link both from senses to examples that represent them, to thesaurus data of synonyms and antonyms, to entries in other dictionaries, including dictionaries in other languages, and to morphology data. So you can see how by following those paths, you can then mix and match and make new resources that are ultimately based on decisions that human beings thinking about language made. So looking as a lexicographer, instead of seeing my work now as an output for humans to read, I also see it as part of this bigger picture. So is it curated or content or raw data? Is it monolingual, bilingual, multilingual? Is it for humans or computers? Is it static or is it interactive? Well, it's all of those things. And so the big challenge for us is to hold that in our heads at the same time when we're making these decisions that are ultimately decisions for a person sitting at their computer and just trying to find out what the word means.